Picture a globe without the hum of jet engines, where the only bridges between continents were the restless waves of the ocean. For thousands of years, long before steel birds crisscrossed the skies, the sea was humanity's greatest connector, a liquid highway that carried not just ships, but the very pulse of civilization itself. Think about it. Every spice that flavored your dinner, every piece of silk that adorned royalty, even the ideas that shaped empires, so much of it traveled not by land or air, but by the unpredictable, unforgiving, yet utterly indispensable sea. This is the story of how water, more than any road or runway, stitched the world together in ways we've barely begun to appreciate. It's easy to forget now, in our age of instant travel and digital connection, but for most of human history, the ocean was the ultimate frontier, both a barrier and a gateway. Ancient Phoenician traders braved storms to spread glass and purple dye across the Mediterranean. Polynesian navigators read the stars and waves to settle islands scattered like pebbles across the Pacific. And when European explorers finally cracked the code of the Atlantic winds, they didn't just discover new lands, they ignited a chain reaction of exchange that would forever alter the course of history. The sea didn't just separate nations, it whispered secrets between them, carrying everything from porcelain to philosophies in the bellies of wooden ships. So what happened on those voyages? What stories lie buried beneath the waves, waiting to be uncovered? This journey isn't just about maps and trade routes, it's about the people who dared to sail into the unknown, the cultures that collided and blended on distant shores, and the astonishing ways a single voyage could ripple across centuries. From the bustling ports of the Silk Road to the treacherous waters of Cape Horn, we're about to unravel how the sea shaped everything from the spices in your kitchen to the languages we speak today. The ocean was the world's first internet, and its mysteries run deeper than you've ever imagined. Ready to dive in, long before merchants kept ledgers or kings minted coins, the first brave souls pushed makeshift rafts into the shallows, driven by curiosity and necessity. Imagine the scene: a handful of reed boats bobbing along the Tigris River 5,000 years ago, loaded with chunks of volcanic glass from distant mountains. That black, razor-sharp obsidian would become knives, arrowheads, even mirrors, passing from hand to hand across hundreds of miles. This wasn't just trade, it was the birth of globalization. Down in the Indus Valley, another revolution was unfolding. Archaeologists have found seashells from the Arabian Sea in homes thousands of miles inland, proof that coastal traders paddled upriver with treasures from the deep. These weren't luxury items, they were essentials. Shells became tools, jewelry, even early currency. And in ancient Egypt, the Nile wasn't just a source of water, it was a liquid highway. Papyrus skiffs carried grain north, while cedar wood from Lebanon floated south, all because someone dared to trust the current. What's astonishing isn't just how far these goods traveled, but how early. We're talking about a time when most humans had never seen a wheel, yet they'd already mastered the art of reading tides and currents. Take the Lapita people of the Pacific. While Europe was still in the Stone Age, they were crossing hundreds of miles of open ocean in outrigger canoes, navigating by the stars to colonize islands from Fiji to Tonga. Their secret, a deep understanding of wave patterns and bird migrations, passed down through chants and stick charts. The real magic of these early voyages wasn't just in the goods exchanged, but in the ideas that hitched rides. A pottery design from Mesopotamia might inspire a craftsman in the Indus Valley. A new fishing technique from coastal Peru could transform life on a Polynesian atoll. Every canoe that landed on a foreign shore became a time capsule of innovation, proof that even in antiquity, the sea wasn't separating cultures. It was quietly weaving them together, one paddle stroke at a time. And let's not forget the unsung heroes, the anonymous traders who memorized every cove and current. Picture a Bronze Age merchant guiding his ship through the treacherous waters of the Red Sea, steering clear of coral reefs by day and following constellations by night. His cargo, frankincense and myrrh, bound for temples thousands of miles away. That's how religion spread. That's how languages evolved. The foundations of our modern world weren't laid in boardrooms or on battlefields. They were shaped in the salt-stained holds of humble boats. None of this was inevitable. Early sailors faced unimaginable risks: shipwrecks, storms, the terror of venturing beyond sight of land. But every time they pushed further, they rewrote the rules of what was possible. A single voyage could turn a local resource into a global commodity, like the cowrie shells from the Maldives that became currency from Africa to China. The sea didn't just connect places, it collapsed distances, creating a web of interdependence that still shapes our lives today. Think about that next time you sprinkle black pepper on your meal. Those tiny grains likely began their journey the same way they did 2,000 years ago, packed in a merchant's hull, bobbing across the Indian Ocean. The spices in your kitchen, the cotton in your clothes, even the words on your screen, they all trace back to those first daring voyages. The ocean didn't just carry cargo. It carried the future. Among the first true architects of maritime globalization were the Phoenicians, a people who turned shipbuilding into an art and navigation into science. Emerging from the narrow strip of land along the eastern Mediterranean around 1200 BCE, they didn't just trade goods, they rewrote the rules of what sea travel could accomplish. Picture their ships, broad-beamed vessels with high prows, built from the famed cedar forests of Lebanon, designed to weather storms and carry cargoes that would make kings envious. Their secret wasn't just sturdy hulls, but an unmatched understanding of wind patterns and coastal currents that let them traverse the Mediterranean like a highway. What set the Phoenicians apart wasn't merely their seafaring skill, but their knack for turning the sea into a marketplace of ideas. Take Tyrian purple, a dye so rare it was worth its weight in silver. Harvested from tiny sea snails along their coast, it became the ultimate status symbol. Royalty from Egypt to Rome craved it for their robes, but the Phoenicians didn't just sell dye, they sold the very concept of luxury, creating demand where none existed before. Their glasswork, too, revolutionized ancient aesthetics. By heating sand to dazzling temperatures, they produced translucent vessels that seemed to capture sunlight itself, spreading not just objects but new standards of beauty across 3 continents. Perhaps their most enduring export, though, was something far lighter than cargo: their alphabet. Unlike the cumbersome hieroglyphs or cuneiform of their neighbors, the Phoenician script was elegantly simple: 22 characters that could record any word. Merchants scribbled it on clay tablets to track shipments, but its real power emerged as it traveled. Greeks adapted it, adding vowels. Romans refined it further. Today, when you read these words, you're seeing the distant echo of Phoenician traders jotting down orders by lamplight. Their colonies became hubs of cultural fusion. Carthage, founded on the North African coast, grew into a metropolis where Egyptian scarabs, Iberian silver, and Greek pottery mingled in bustling harbors. But these weren't just trading posts, they were laboratories of globalization. A Carthaginian artisan might blend Phoenician motifs with local Berber designs, creating hybrid artworks that sailed back to the Levant on returning ships. The sea didn't just move goods, it became a conduit for creativity, where styles and traditions cross-pollinated with every voyage. Yet their greatest legacy might be their boldness to sail beyond the horizon. While others clung to coastlines, Phoenician captains pushed past the Pillars of Hercules, modern Gibraltar, into the stormy Atlantic. One account tells of a voyage commissioned by Egyptian pharaoh Necho, where Phoenician sailors allegedly circumnavigated Africa over 3 years, replenishing supplies by beaching their ships to plant and harvest grain. True or not, the story captures their reputation, masters of endurance who saw the ocean not as a barrier but as a bridge to the unimaginable. The Phoenicians didn't just navigate waters, they navigated human ambition. When their cedar planks flexed in Atlantic gales, they were testing the limits of how far culture could travel. Every amphora of wine shipped to Sardinia, every ingot of British tin hauled back to the Levant, tightened the web of connections that would one day bind the world. They proved that globalization wasn't invented in boardrooms or by empires, it was born in the creak of ropes and the smell of salt air, pioneered by sailors who understood that the sea doesn't divide. It unites. The monsoon winds didn't just bring rain, they shaped empires. Every summer, like clockwork, southwest winds filled the sails of ships leaving the Red Sea and East Africa, carrying them toward India's spice ports. Come winter, the winds reversed, blowing northeast to bring those vessels home. This predictable rhythm turned the Indian Ocean into history's first superhighway, where a single sailing season could transport silk from China to Rome or pepper from Kerala to a Venetian merchant's table. What made this maritime Silk Road so extraordinary wasn't just the goods exchanged, but the sheer scale of cooperation it required. Arab navigators relied on the camel, a simple wooden rectangle that measured stars' heights to calculate latitude. Chinese junks, some over 400 feet long with 9 masts, carried porcelain so fine it glowed like moonlight. Indian merchants in bustling Cambay spoke a dozen languages, brokering deals between traders from as far as Zanzibar and Java. Unlike the overland Silk Road's caravans plodding through deserts, these ships moved entire bazaars across oceans in weeks. Take black pepper, the king of spices. Roman elites paid for it by weight in silver, and medieval European towns kept their stocks under lock and key. But few who sprinkled it on their food knew the journey behind each peppercorn. Harvested in Kerala's steamy hills, the spice traveled down river to ports like Muziris, where Greek, Persian, and Tamil merchants haggled under coconut palms. From there, Arab D-house carried it to Aden, where camels took over for the desert crossing to Alexandria. Finally, Venetian galleys transported it to Europe's tables, a journey spanning 12,000 miles and 3 continents, all because sailors learned to ride the monsoons. The real treasure wasn't in the cargo holds, though it was in the minds of those who crossed these waters. A single ship might carry Buddhist pilgrims from China, Persian astronomers with star charts, and African healers with medicinal plants. When Zheng, his massive treasure fleets, visited Swahili cities in the 15th century, they exchanged not just porcelain for giraffes, but engineering knowledge for navigation techniques. Malay sailors taught Arabs how to rig lateen sails. Gujarati shipbuilders shared techniques for waterproofing hulls with coconut fiber. This was globalization in action centuries before the word existed. Port cities became melting pots where cultures blurred. In Gwangju, China's city of light, you could hear Arabic prayers from minarets near Taoist temples, while Persian merchants dined from Vietnamese ceramics. The Malabar Coast's Jewish communities preserved scrolls in Hebrew while trading with Muslim neighbors, and in Srivijaya's Sumatran ports, sailors from across Asia gathered to exchange not just goods, but stories, transforming the ocean from a barrier into a vast storytelling network. The ocean's highways even birthed new technologies. Shipwrights from Oman to Korea developed sternpost rudders for better control. Navigators created portolan charts, early maps with wind roses that looked like spiderwebs, marking safe harbors and dangerous reefs. The magnetic compass, possibly invented in China, spread westward through these maritime networks, revolutionizing navigation. Every innovation was a collective triumph, passed from ship to ship like a whispered secret. What's astonishing is how little this system relied on empires or armies. No single power controlled the maritime Silk Road. It thrived precisely because it was a free-flowing network of equal partners. Tamil merchants financed voyages with pooled investments resembling modern joint stock companies. Malay pirates and Chinese officials negotiated tolls rather than waging wars. For centuries, this self-regulating system proved that commerce could be more powerful than conquest. The legacy of this liquid Silk Road still surrounds us. The chai in your cup, its spices followed routes mapped by medieval Arab traders. The batik pattern on your shirt, its technique sailed from India to Indonesia on 8th century cloth voyages. Even our modern shipping lanes trace ancient paths first charted by sailors who navigated by stars, winds, and the simple courage to trust the horizon. The ocean didn't just move luxury goods, it quietly wove the fabric of our interconnected world. The sleek silhouette of a Viking longship slicing through North Atlantic fog remains one of history's most enduring images, but these vessels were far more than raiding machines. With hulls barely deeper than a man's waist, they could glide up shallow rivers or brave open ocean swells, making them the all-terrain vehicles of the medieval world. What truly set them apart was their ingenious design. Overlapping oak planks allowed the ships to flex like living creatures in rough seas, while symmetrical bows and sterns meant they could reverse direction without turning. This wasn't just boat building, it was hydrodynamic poetry. Consider the journey of Leif Erikson around the year 1000. While most of Europe still believed the ocean ended in a yawning abyss, his crew navigated from Greenland to a place they called Vinland, likely modern Newfoundland. They did it without compasses, relying instead on a sun compass that cast shadows on wooden dials, and by reading the color of waves and the flight paths of seabirds. When Norse sagas described sailors spotting landsclouds, fixed clouds over distant shores, they were documenting an early form of meteorological navigation still used by Pacific Islanders today. But the Vikings weren't just explorers, they were history's first global entrepreneurs. Their trade routes formed a vast northern web. Swedish Varangians rode down Russian rivers to Constantinople, hauling amber and furs to exchange for Byzantine silks. Danish merchants sailed to Dublin's slave markets, then onward to Baghdad with human cargo destined for the Abbasid Caliphate. Even their raids were part business strategy. Capturing silver from Anglo-Saxon monasteries allowed them to buy goods from as far as Afghanistan, creating an economic loop that stretched across continents. The secret to their success lay in adaptability. In Normandy, Vikings became farmers adopting French customs. In Iceland, they turned volcanic soil into thriving settlements. And in places like Novgorod, their trading posts grew into powerful city-states. This flexibility extended to their ships. The Nar, a broader version of the longship, could carry 16 tons of cargo. Whether it be Sicilian grain for Norwegian winters or Greenland walrus ivory bound for European cathedrals, where it was carved into exquisite religious art. Their maritime legacy lingers in unexpected places. The word anchor comes from Old Norse, as does keel. Their ship burial rituals influenced coastal communities from Scotland to the Black Sea. And when archaeologists unearthed a Viking trading post in Newfoundland, they found butternuts from New England, proof that these sailors explored further south than the sagas recorded. The sea didn't just carry Vikings to new lands, it carried their influence into the DNA of cultures they touched, from Russian tax systems to English place names ending in by and Thorpe. Perhaps the greatest testament to their skill lies in what they didn't do. Unlike later European explorers, Vikings rarely sought to conquer or convert. They came as traders, settlers, sometimes raiders, but always as students of the waters they mastered. When they abandoned their North American settlements after brief stays, it wasn't due to failed navigation, but complex calculations about supply lines and hostile neighbors. Even in retreat, they demonstrated a sailor's pragmatism, the understanding that no journey, no matter how bold, is worth pursuing without reading the tides of circumstance. Today, as modern cargo ships trace routes first mapped by Norse sailors, we're still learning from their innovations. Museum replicas have proven that longships could cross the North Atlantic in just 3 weeks faster than some modern yachts. Their legacy reminds us that exploration isn't just about discovering new lands, but about bridging worlds in ways that endure. The Vikings didn't just ride the waves, they taught humanity how to see the ocean not as a moat separating peoples, but as a meeting place where cultures could collide, merge, and ultimately understand one another. The lateen sail changed everything. With its triangular shape catching the wind at perfect angles, it allowed Arab dhows to slice through the Indian Ocean's waters with astonishing efficiency. These weren't just boats, they were floating masterpieces of engineering, built from teak and coconut wood without a single nail, their planks stitched together with coir rope that flexed with the waves. Picture a dhow at sunset, its sail like a curved blade against the horizon, carrying frankincense so precious that ancient Egyptians believed its smoke carried prayers to the gods. What made the dhow trade revolutionary was its seasonal precision. From November to March, northeast winds carried ships from Arabia to India's Malabar coast and beyond. Come April, the winds reversed, bringing vessels laden with Sumatran pepper and Javanese spices back to the Red Sea. This wasn't just navigation, it was a celestial dance timed to monsoons so reliable that merchants could plan multi-year voyages like clockwork. A single dhow might leave Oman with dates and copper, swap for Indian cotton in Gujarat, then exchange that for nutmeg in the Spice Islands before circling back home. A 3-year odyssey covering 12,000 miles. Ports like Aden became the ancient world stock exchanges. Here, Somali frankincense met Chinese porcelain, while Tamil merchants haggled over Zanzibar's ivory in a babel of languages. The real magic happened in places like Malacca, where a single dock might host Persian astronomers debating with Javanese shipwrights, Arab physicians sharing medical knowledge with Siamese traders, and African pearl divers comparing notes with Sumatran spice growers. These weren't just transactions, they were spontaneous universities of global knowledge. The commodities tell their own story. Take pearls from Bahrain's beds, divers would hold their breath for 2 minutes to plunge 100 feet, gathering oysters that would adorn crowns from Constantinople to Chang'an. Or consider the humble coconut. Arab traders discovered every part could be used: husks for rope, shells for cups, oil for lamps, making it the ultimate multipurpose cargo. Even sandalwood from Timor found its way to Arabian incense burners and Chinese temples, its fragrance blending with myrrh in rituals spanning continents. Navigation relied on genius disguised as simplicity. The camel, just a wooden rectangle with knotted strings, let sailors measure latitude by aligning Polaris with the horizon. At night, they followed the stairs of the Arabs, sequences of stars that rose like celestial signposts. During daylight, pilots watched wave patterns, the long swells of open ocean versus the choppy rebound near islands. One medieval Arab navigational manual describes finding the Andaman Islands by tasting seawater. Certain currents carried distinct mineral flavors from distant rivers. The legacy of these routes still shapes our world. When Vasco da Gama reached India in 1498, his Portuguese caravels relied on Arab pilots who'd sailed those waters for centuries. The word monsoon comes from the Arabic mawsim, meaning season, a linguistic fossil of this trade. Even modern shipping lanes between Dubai and Mumbai trace paths first mapped by how captains reading the stars. Perhaps the greatest testament to this system's sophistication was its resilience. Unlike later European colonial trade, the Indian Ocean network thrived on reciprocity. No single empire controlled it. A Gujarati shipwreck found off Oman contained Chinese ceramics, African ebony, and Arabian glassware in one hold, proof that commerce flowed freely across cultures. For over 1,000 years, this maritime Silk Road proved that globalization didn't require conquest, just shared knowledge of winds, currents, and the universal language of trade. Next time you see a coconut or smell sandalwood, remember, you're encountering fragments of a maritime network that connected continents when most maps still showed edge-of-the-world monsters. The dhows may have vanished, but the cultural bridges they built still endure in our spices, our words, even our stars. The Indian Ocean wasn't just a marketplace. It was humanity's first experiment in peaceful globalization, written not in treaties, but in tide charts and trade winds. Imagine floating cities made of teak and pine, their crimson sails blotting out the horizon as they glide across the Indian Ocean. At the heart of this armada stands Admiral Zheng, a 7-foot-tall eunuch with the bearing of an emperor, commanding a fleet that would make Columbus's ships look like bathtub toys. His treasure ships stretched 400 feet from stem to stern, longer than a football field with 9 masts and decks stacked like pagodas. While Europe was still emerging from the Middle Ages, China's Ming dynasty was sending 30,000 men across the waves in 300 vessels, not to conquer, but to awe the world into peaceful submission. These weren't just ships, they were mobile embassies stocked with marvels. Holds overflowed with blue and white porcelain so delicate it rang like crystal, bolts of silk woven with gold thread, and lacquerware that reflected faces like black mirrors. But the real treasures were intangible. Imperial scrolls declaring the Yongle Emperor's benevolence, astrolabes for mapping foreign skies, and medical encyclopedias containing remedies from across Asia. When Zhenghi's fleet dropped anchor in Calicut or Malacca, it wasn't just trade goods that came ashore. It was the very image of Chinese civilization, calculated to dazzle. The logistics boggle the mind. Each voyage required enough rice to feed a city, carried in specialized grain ships with rat-proof ceramic storage. Navigators used star measuring boards to track celestial movements, while doctors aboard kept epidemics at bay with herbal fumigations. The fleet even included horse ships with stables for Arabian stallions and water tankers supplying fresh drinking liquid for months. This wasn't exploration, it was a floating metropolis executing a ballet of precision across thousands of miles. Diplomacy unfolded like an intricate dance. In Sri Lanka, Zhenghi erected trilingual stone tablets praising local gods alongside Buddha and Allah. When encountering pirates near Sumatra, he outmaneuvered them with tactical brilliance, capturing their leader only to pardon him later as a show of mercy. His visits to East African city-states like Mogadishu sparked a cultural exchange that brought giraffes to Beijing's Imperial Zoo, where they were mistaken for mythical Killen, and introduced Chinese acupuncture to Swahili healers. What makes these voyages extraordinary is what they chose not to do. Unlike later European explorers, Zheng's armada never established colonies, demanded territory, or forced conversions. Their cannons remained silent unless attacked. The goal wasn't extraction, but recognition, a celestial empire collecting tribute through sheer magnificence rather than muskets. When African rulers presented zebras as gifts, Chinese artists meticulously painted them not as curiosities, but as equals in the emperor's cosmic menagerie. The fleet's sudden end remains one of history's great what-ifs. After 7 epic voyages between 1405 and 1433, a new emperor banned oceanic expeditions, burned the fleet's records, and turned China inward. Some say it was fiscal conservatism, others cite Confucian scholars' distrust of merchant classes, but the consequences were profound. Just decades later, Portuguese caravels rounded Africa's tip armed with cannons and crusading zeal to dominate the very waters China had peacefully patrolled. Zheng's legacy lingers in unexpected places. DNA studies suggest some Malagasy people carried Chinese ancestry, possibly from shipwrecked sailors. The junk's sternpost rudder became a template for European shipbuilders. And in coastal temples from Java to Kerala, statues of the admirals still receive offerings as a protector of sailors. His voyages proved that maritime power didn't require conquest, it could be wielded through silk and diplomacy, leaving not ruins but stories whispered across oceans. The Mediterranean wasn't just a sea, it was a chessboard where empires moved their fleets like pieces, each maneuver rewriting history. Picture the Athenian trireme, a sleek wooden predator powered by 170 rowers arranged in 3 tiers, its bronze ram capable of shearing through enemy hulls at 10 knots. These weren't merely warships, they were floating democracies. Every free citizen, from potter to politician, took turns at the oars, binding naval power directly to the idea of civic participation. When Athens defeated the Persians at Salamis in 480 BCE, it wasn't just a military victory, it was the moment sea power became synonymous with cultural survival. Rome took maritime dominance to brutal new heights. Their corvus, a rotating gangplank with a massive iron spike, transformed naval combat into something resembling land battles. As Roman boarding parties stormed Carthaginian decks during the Punic Wars, they weren't just fighting for territory, they were battling for control of the Mediterranean's grain routes. The sea that had been a Greek cultural highway became Rome's breadbasket, with Egyptian wheat feeding the empire's million-strong capital. Ships carrying North African olive oil left permanent stains on Ostra's docks, ancient trade receipts written in stone. Then came Venice, where maritime empire became high art. The Arsenal shipyard could produce a fully armed galley in a single day, its assembly line anticipating Industrial Revolution efficiency by 6 centuries. Venetian navigators guarded secret maps of Mediterranean currents like state secrets, while their glassmakers confined to the island of Murano to prevent fire hazards created lenses that would later revolutionize astronomy. The Republic's golden ducat became the dollar of its day, accepted from Constantinople to Cairo, proving that naval power wasn't just about cannons, it was about currency and credit. What set these Mediterranean powers apart was their understanding of the sea as a 3-dimensional battlefield. The Greeks mastered coastal navigation, using island chains as stepping stones. Romans built lighthouses like the one at Dover, turning geography into infrastructure. Venetians pioneered marine insurance, calculating risks with mathematical precision. Each innovation revealed a deeper truth. Controlling the Mediterranean meant mastering not just waves, but wind patterns, trade laws, and even the tides of human migration. The sea's influence seeped into every aspect of culture. Homer's Odyssey became the Mediterranean's foundational myth, a tale of sea wanderings that shaped Greek identity. Roman mosaics in Pompeii depict octopuses and shellfish, celebrating maritime abundance. Venetian painters like Canaletto turned harbors into masterpieces, their brushstrokes capturing the play of light on water with almost scientific accuracy. Even language bore the sea's imprint. Our word navigation comes from the Latin navis, meaning ship, while admiral traces back to the Arabic Amir al-Bahr, commander of the sea. Yet for all their brilliance, these empires eventually receded like tides. Athens' navy drained its treasury, Rome's grain fleets made it dependent on foreign harvests, and Venice's trade monopoly crumbled when Portuguese explorers found ocean routes to India. Their stories remind us that maritime dominance is always temporary, a lesson carried on every wave that still laps against Mediterranean shores, whispering of triremes and trading galleys long turned to driftwood. By the 15th century, the Mediterranean had become a crowded stage too small for the ambitions of Europe's rising powers. What set this new age apart wasn't just the desire to explore, but the perfect storm of technologies and tensions that made long-distance voyages suddenly possible. Take the humble caravel, with its lateen sails borrowed from Arab designs and sturdy hull adapted from Nordic ships. It could tack against the wind like no vessel before it. Now picture Prince Henry of Portugal, known as the Navigator, though he rarely sailed himself, standing at Saga's Point, watching these ships disappear over the horizon. His obsession wasn't just maps, it was mathematics. He gathered Jewish cartographers, Arab astronomers, and German instrument makers to create navigation manuals so precise they could guide sailors beyond the feared Cape Bojador, where medieval legends claimed the sea boiled. Spices were the siren song. A single pound of nutmeg could buy a farm in Venice. Pepper was measured out like gold dust. But the old routes were choked Ottoman taxes on Silk Road caravans, pirate-infested Red Sea passages, so Europe's kingdoms bet everything on finding ocean paths to Asia. Columbus's miscalculation became history's greatest accident. When his Santa Maria ran aground in the Caribbean in 1492, he insisted these were the Indies, dying convinced he'd reached Asia. Meanwhile, Portuguese Captain Bartolomeu Dias proved Africa could be rounded when he got blown past the Cape of Good Hope in 1488, his crew threatening mutiny until they noticed the coastline curving northward at last. The real game changer wasn't just new lands, but new ways of thinking about the sea itself. Previously, oceans were barriers with known edges. Now they became highways stretching beyond imagination. Spanish and Portuguese navigators divided the globe with the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494, drawing a line down the Atlantic as if the planet were a pie to be sliced. Their astrolabes could measure latitude by the sun's height, while hourglasses marked 4-hour watches, crude but effective timekeeping that let ships maintain course for weeks. What's often forgotten is how these voyages relied on global knowledge. Columbus studied maps from a Florentine astronomer who'd corresponded with Arab scholars. Portuguese sailors used Arabic-derived words like azimuth for navigation. Even the compass, that lodestone in a wooden box, had traveled from Chinese inventors through Muslim traders before reaching European hands. This wasn't just European exploration. It was humanity's collective maritime knowledge reaching critical mass. The consequences unfolded like tidal waves. Spanish galleons hauled silver from Potosi to Manila, where it bought Chinese silks for European markets, history's first true global trade loop. Diseases hidden in sailors' bloodstreams devastated Native American populations, while tomatoes and potatoes from the Andes revolutionized European diets. The sea had always connected cultures, but now it bound them in an inescapable web of exchange and exploitation. Where Phoenician traders once carried glass beads as gifts, European holds now brimmed with enslaved people and gunpowder. Yet amid the brutality, astonishing cross-pollination occurred. Basque whalers taught Iroquois communities how to render blubber, while Algonquin fishing techniques saved Jamestown settlers from starvation. Dutch merchants in Indonesia learned to predict monsoons from Javanese pilots, just as Portuguese sailors in Japan adopted local shipbuilding tricks. The ocean remained what it had always been, a medium of connection, but the scale and stakes had multiplied beyond reckoning. Perhaps the most telling artifact isn't a ship or map, but a single page from a sailor's logbook. On Magellan's doomed circumnavigation, his scribe Antonio Pigafetta recorded words from unfamiliar tongues, the first European attempt to write down Patagonian or Visayan phrases. That fragile manuscript captures the essence of this era, the sea as a place of terrifying unknowns and wondrous discoveries, where every wave carried the potential to rewrite everything humanity thought it knew about the world. The Portuguese caravel was more than a ship, it was a floating revolution. With its slender hull and combination of square and triangular sails, this vessel could do what no European ship had managed before: sail reliably against the wind. Picture these agile craft bobbing in Lisbon's harbor around 1490, their decks piled with astrolabes polished to a shine and rutters handwritten navigation guides filled with generations of sailors' hard-won knowledge. This wasn't just new technology, it was Europe's ticket to bypass the chokeholds of Mediterranean and overland spice routes. Vasco da Gama's 1498 voyage didn't just make history, it shattered an entire economic order. When his battered caravels limped into Calicut after 10 months at sea, their holds contained little to impress Indian merchants, some wool, honey, and cheap trinkets. But what they carried in their logs was priceless: the sea path to the source of pepper, cinnamon, and cloves. The Arab traders who dominated this route for centuries watched in disbelief as the Portuguese undercut their prices by 60% overnight. Lisbon's docks soon smelled like a millionaire's kitchen, with sacks of black pepper piled higher than houses and the sound of gold coins clinking in counting houses day and night. What made Portugal's success truly remarkable was their navigation alchemy. Arab pilots had long used the camel to measure latitude, but Portuguese captains like da Gama took it further. They cross-referenced solar readings with detailed new charts called portolans, where compass lines radiated like spiderwebs across parchment. At sea, they timed their turns with hourglasses filled precisely for 4-hour watches. Even their sails were tactical innovations: the lateen rig borrowed from Arab dhows for maneuvering, combined with square sails for raw speed down Africa's coast. The human cost of this spice race often gets forgotten. Da Gama lost 2 of his 4 ships and a third of his crew to scurvy and storms. Sailors whispered of sea monsters beyond Cape Bojador, where the water supposedly boiled. One chronicle describes men so desperate during the voyage home that they burned their own shirts to cook moldy rice, yet the rewards kept them coming back. A single successful run could net profits equal to 60 years' wages for a common sailor, which explains why Lisbon's shipyards worked around the clock, turning out caravels like coins from a mint. Portugal's real genius lay in turning the ocean into a toll road. Instead of colonizing vast territories, they built a network of fortified ports from Mozambique to Malacca. Any ship wanting to trade in spices had to pay duties to Portuguese factors, a system so ruthlessly efficient that Venice's merchants went bankrupt waiting for caravans that never came. The old overland Silk Road withered almost overnight, as did the power of Middle Eastern intermediaries who'd grown fat on markups for centuries. The ripple effects transformed global cuisine and culture. Italian recipes suddenly called for reckless amounts of once rare spices. German pharmacists stocked Southeast Asian nutmeg as medicine. Even distant Japan first tasted European firearms when a Portuguese caravel accidentally drifted to Tanegashima in 1543, its cargo of muskets rewriting samurai warfare. The sea had always connected civilizations, but now it did so at unprecedented speed and scale, with Portugal holding all the toll booth keys, yet their dominance contained the seeds of its own decline. The very caravel design they perfected would soon be outclassed by heavier Dutch flights and English galleons, and by hoarding knowledge in Lisbon's Costa da India, where maps were state secrets punishable by death, they failed to adapt when rivals eventually stole their techniques. The sea rewards no nation forever, as the Portuguese would learn when their spice monopoly crumbled beneath waves of competition. But for one brilliant century, a small kingdom on Europe's edge proved that with the right ships and enough nerve, the ocean could make you master of the world's most coveted flavors. Spanish galleons weren't just ships, they were floating fortresses that carried the weight of empires across the Pacific. Picture these towering vessels, their hulls blackened by tropical sun and salt spray, lumbering through typhoon swells with holds packed to the beams with Mexican silver. A single galleon could carry 2 million pesos worth of treasure, enough to bankroll entire wars, yet their true value wasn't in the cargo, but in the revolutionary trade route they pioneered. The Manila-Acapulco run, spanning 15,000 miles of open ocean, became history's first regularly scheduled trans-Pacific highway, knitting together continents that barely knew each other existed. What made this route extraordinary wasn't just the distance, but the economic alchemy it performed. In Manila's Parian market, Spanish merchants traded American silver for Chinese silks, porcelain, and lacquerware, all while standing ankle-deep in monsoon mud. That same silver would sail east to Acapulco, cross Mexico by mule train, then board Spanish treasure fleets bound for Seville. But here's the twist, much of it ended up right back in China through European merchants buying tea and porcelain. The sea had created a global conveyor belt where silver circled the planet like water in a fountain, greasing the wheels of commerce from Canton to Cadiz. The galleons themselves were marvels of hybrid engineering. Built in Filipino shipyards from Asian hardwoods, they combined European hull designs with Chinese junk-style rudders and Malay sail techniques. Their crews reflected this cultural fusion, Spanish officers commanding Tagalog sailors, with Chinese merchants huddled below decks guarding their precious silk bundles. Even the food was a traveling bazaar. Mexican chocolate shared storage with jars of Japanese soy sauce, while sacks of Peruvian quinoa rubbed against baskets of Philippine durian. Surviving the voyage required brutal endurance. Ships often took 6 months to beat against prevailing winds, their crews decimated by scurvy. One account describes sailors so desperate for fresh food that they scraped barnacles off the hull to boil into broth. Typhoons could snap masts like twigs. The San Diego galleon sank in 1600 with all hands, taking down a fortune in Ming porcelain now displayed in Manila's museums. Yet the rewards kept the system running for 250 years. A single successful voyage could yield profits exceeding 5,000%, turning merchants into nobility overnight. The ripple effects transformed global economies. Chinese markets became addicted to American silver, leading Ming dynasty tax collectors to demand payments in the metal. Mexican haciendas planted Filipino coconut palms, while Andalusian aristocrats sipped Chinese tea from porcelain cups. Even language bears traces of this exchange. The Filipino word for market, palenque, comes from the Mexican Spanish palenque, a legacy of Acapulco's influence. Spain's real power lay in controlling the entire supply chain. From Potosi's silver mines to Manila's docks, every link depended on naval mastery. When English privateers like Francis Drake attacked Spanish ships, they weren't just seeking treasure. they were trying to sever the arteries of empire. But the system proved resilient. Even after the galleon trade officially ended in 1815, its cultural DNA persisted. Modern container ships still follow similar Pacific routes, and the peso's symbol dollar remains a reminder of when the sea turned silver into the world's first truly global currency. What's often overlooked is how this trade route presaged modern globalization. The galleons didn't just move goods, they transferred technologies. Filipino shipbuilders taught Mexicans tropical woodworking techniques, while Chinese porcelain designs influenced Mexican Talavera pottery. The sea became a school where cultures exchanged knowledge as freely as spices. In an age when empires usually conquered by the sword, Spain's galleons proved something revolutionary: that wealth could travel as smoothly as waves, and power could be measured not in territory, but in control of the currents that connected the world. The Dutch East India Company didn't just sail the oceans, it owned them. Chartered in 1602, the VOC became the world's first corporate superpower, wielding more influence than most kingdoms. Picture their fleets, not just ships but floating fortresses with 30 cannons each, their hulls stuffed with nutmeg and cloves worth more than gold by weight. This wasn't commerce, it was conquest disguised as trade, where profit margins dictated borders and shareholders voted on wars. What set the VOC apart was its ruthless efficiency. They issued the first stock certificates, turning Amsterdam's canal-side taverns into the original stock exchanges. Sailors signed ironclad contracts with penalty clauses that could bankrupt families, yet the rewards were staggering. A single successful spice run might yield 400% returns, enough to transform a clerk into a gentleman. Their ledgers recorded every penny, from the cost of rope in Rotterdam to the price of pepper in Jakarta, creating capitalism's first paper trail across continents. The company's grip on Indonesia rewrote geography itself. To control nutmeg production, they invaded the Banda Islands, reducing the native population from 15,000 to 600 through massacres and starvation. When English competitors dared to set up shop, VOC officers tortured and executed them under company justice. They even manipulated ecosystems, burning spice trees on rival islands to create artificial scarcity, turning the Moluccas into a monoculture plantation 4 centuries before the term existed. Yet the VOC's true innovation was turning the sea into a spreadsheet. Their ships followed rigid schedules, their maps showed not just coastlines but profit zones, and their accountants pioneered double-entry bookkeeping to track assets across hemispheres. The company built hospitals in Cape Town, forts in Sri Lanka, and canals in Batavia, not for empire but for supply chain management. When a VOC clerk in Japan noted that local nobles would pay triple for striped silk, the order reached Persian weavers within months. This maritime empire had an Achilles heel: greed. As dividends soared, corruption festered. Captains smuggled spices in false-bottomed chests. Governors took bribes to look the other way, and by the 1700s, the VOC was spending more on silver to pay Asian partners than it earned from European sales. The world's first corporate bankruptcy came in 1799, leaving behind ghost ports and a mountain of debt, but also the blueprint for every multinational that followed. The VOC's legacy lingers in surprising places. New York City started as New Amsterdam, a VOC trading post. South Africa's Afrikaans language traces to Dutch company clerks. Even modern stock markets still use VOC-era terms like preferred shares. Their story proves that when the sea becomes a business model, waves don't just carry ships, they carry the weight of entire economic systems, for better or worse. The golden age of piracy wasn't just about skull and crossbones flags. It was a direct response to the empires crisscrossing the oceans with treasure. Picture Blackbeard's Queen Anne's Revenge. its rigging strung with slow-burning fuses to wreathe the infamous pirate in smoke like some demon from the deep. But behind the theatrics lay cold calculation. Pirates like Edward Teach didn't just stumble into infamy, they exploited the very systems empires had built. Spanish silver routes became their hunting grounds, and overcrowded Caribbean ports turned into recruiting hubs where disgruntled sailors swapped navy wages for a cut of plunder. Privateers like Sir Francis Drake operated in a legal gray zone licensed by governments to loot enemy ships while waving patriotic flags. Drake's raid on the Spanish Silver Train in 1573 wasn't mere banditry, it was geopolitics by other means. With Queen Elizabeth's tacit approval, he ambushed mule trains carrying Peruvian silver across Panama, hauling away enough treasure to fund England's navy for years. The sea didn't just breed outlaws, it created sanctioned chaos where national heroes and criminals wore the same face. What's often missed is how pirate crews functioned as floating democracies. Articles of agreement signed by every member guaranteed equal shares of loot and compensation for injuries. A lost leg might earn you 600 pieces of 8, while a lost eye fetched 100. Captains were elected and could be deposed by vote, a radical notion when European monarchs claimed divine right. Pirate havens like Nassau became bizarre experiments in meritocracy, where escaped slaves and indentured servants could rise to command ships. The sea's lawlessness didn't just breed violence, it offered fleeting glimpses of alternative societies. The tools of piracy reveal their ingenuity. Pirates favored fast, shallow drafted sloops that could outmaneuver bulky merchant vessels. They used false flags to approach targets before raising the Jolly Roger at the last moment, a psychological weapon as much as a threat. One captain's ledger recovered from a wreck shows meticulous accounting. Bolts of fabric traded for gunpowder in Madagascar, a portion of gold set aside to bribe colonial officials. This wasn't mindless plunder, it was a shadow economy running parallel to imperial trade. Legends grew faster than facts. Blackbeard's supposed invincibility stemmed from clever stagecraft, his fuses, his braided beard tucked with matches, while Calico Jack Rackham's fame came less from his hauls than from the 2 women in his crew who disguised themselves as men. The pirate mythos became so potent that captured buccaneers on trial would perform outrageous antics, knowing their stories would outlive them. Yet the sea giveth and the sea taketh away. The same currents that carried pirates to riches could strand them on barren atolls. When Britain's navy finally cracked down, former pirates like Henry Morgan reinvented themselves as colonial governors, proving that in the maritime world, identities were as fluid as the tides. The Golden Age ended not with a bang, but with a ledger insurance markets and naval patrols made piracy less profitable than trade. But for a few decades, these outlaws reminded empires that no ship, no matter how heavily armed, was truly safe on the open ocean. Their legacy lingers in everything from maritime insurance clauses to the romantic anti-heroes of modern films, proof that even in defeat, pirates won the battle for our imaginations. The decks of slave ships carried a terrible arithmetic, human beings reduced to numbers in a captain's ledger. A typical vessel built in Liverpool or Nantes might measure 100 feet from stem to stern, yet pack 600 enslaved people into spaces tighter than coffins. The infamous Brooks diagram from 1788 shows bodies stacked like spoons, each allotted less room than a grave. But what these blueprints don't capture is the smell of sweat and waste, the sound of shackles clinking with every wave, or the way Atlantic storms made the timbers groan like tortured spirits. This wasn't just trade, it was industrialized suffering on an oceanic scale. Ships left Europe with holds full of brass manillas, Indian textiles, and guns, exchanging them for captives at forts like Ghana's Elmina Castle. After the grueling Middle Passage to Brazil or the Caribbean, survivors were traded for sugar, tobacco, and cotton that would sweeten European palates and clothe its factories. The sea that had once carried spices and silks now transported misery in precise commercial cycles, a triangle of profit with human agony at its core. The logistics of horror were chillingly efficient. British ships like the Hannibal installed nets to catch those who jumped overboard. French captains calculated rations to the ounce, knowing most captives wouldn't survive the 6-week crossing anyway. Some vessels carried specimen Africans topside strong young men scrubbed clean to showcase at auctions, while hundreds more withered below decks in their own filth. The sea that had connected civilizations for millennia now served as a liquid conveyor belt for genocide. Yet amidst the darkness, the ocean also carried resistance. The Amistad Rebellion of 1839 saw captives seize control off Cuba's coast, their leader sink using celestial navigation to steer toward freedom. Other ships mysteriously ran aground on calm nights, whispers suggesting enslaved pilots had sabotaged the rudders. Even the spirituals sung below decks traveled across waters, their coded messages about escape routes blending with the creak of rigging. The economic aftershocks reshaped continents. Ports like Bristol and Bordeaux blossomed with ornate buildings funded by black gold. New Orleans' French Quarter thrived on slave auction fees, while Brazilian sugar plantations bankrolled Rio's opera houses. The sea didn't just transport this wealth, it laundered it, turning blood-stained profits into respectable fortunes. Modern insurance giants like Lloyd's of London trace their origins to policies covering slave ships, a reminder of how deeply this system penetrated global finance. What lingers today isn't just the trauma, but the cultural currents that survived the crossing. In Bahian capoeira dances, the martial arts disguised as folk music recall Angolan ancestors practicing combat under slavers' noses. Haitian Vodou ceremonies preserve West African spirits worshipped in secret aboard ships. The very rhythm of blues music echoes the rowing chants of galley slaves. The sea took millions, but it couldn't drown the memories they carried in their bones. This chapter stains maritime history not because it's exceptional, but because it reveals the ocean's dual nature, a bridge for both wonders and atrocities. The same waves that bore Zheng He's treasure ships and Polynesian explorers also swallowed generations of stolen lives without a trace. Perhaps that's the hardest lesson. That water doesn't judge what it carries, leaving humanity to wrestle with the moral weight of its own crossings. Before electric grids illuminated cities, the world burned bright with the oil of whales, sperm whales, to be precise, whose massive heads held reservoirs of waxy liquid that burned cleaner and brighter than anything else on Earth. Picture the whaling bark Charles W. Morgan setting sail from New Bedford in 1841, its crew unaware they'd spend the next 3 years scouring the Pacific for leviathans. These weren't just hunting trips, they were industrial expeditions. A single large sperm whale could yield 40 barrels of oil, enough to light every home in a small town for months. The sea, once seen as a barrier, had become a global gas station, and whalers were its roughneck drillers. Nantucket's cobblestone streets tell the story of this oil rush. Quaker merchants built fortunes on candle factories that supplied London's street lamps, while blacksmiths forged harpoons so specialized they had their own patents. The town's rooftops sprouted widows' walks, not for romantic sea-gazing, but for wives scanning the horizon for returning ships that might never come. Whaling was so dangerous that by 1850, 1 in 6 Nantucket men who left port would die at sea, crushed by flukes or lost in Arctic ice, yet the rewards kept coming. A successful voyage could net profits 20 times the ship's original cost, turning captains into millionaires overnight. The anatomy of a whaling ship reveals how this trade previewed modern industry. Below decks, try-pots the size of bathtubs boiled blubber into oil around the clock, filling the air with a greasy smoke that clung to sailors' lungs. Crews included not just harpooners, but coopers to maintain barrels, blacksmiths to repair tools, and even surgeons to treat injuries, a self-sufficient factory at sea. Logbooks from the Essex, later immortalized in Moby Dick, show meticulous records of oil yields per whale, like an early corporate spreadsheet tracking productivity metrics. Whaling's global reach rewrote maritime maps. New England fleets chased sperm whales off Japan years before Commodore Perry opened the country. The Arctic became a battleground where ships raced to hunt bowhead whales before winter ice trapped them. Even remote islands like the Azores transformed into supply depots where fresh vegetables were traded for news from home. This wasn't just hunting, it was resource extraction on an industrial scale, with whale oil lubricating the very machines of the Industrial Revolution. The environmental impact was staggering. By 1850, the Pacific sperm whale population had collapsed by 70%, yet the industry adapted with chilling efficiency. When sperm whales grew scarce, fleets switched to right whales, then bowheads, then even smaller species. Each extinction crisis met with new targets. The sea's bounty, once thought infinite, proved fragile under the demands of progress. Whaling's legacy lingers in unexpected places. Modern petroleum drilling borrowed terms like barrel from whaling parlance. The first offshore oil wells reused whaling techniques for deep-sea extraction. Even our concept of corporate globalization traces back to these floating factories that connected remote ocean ecosystems to urban lamp posts half a world away. The next time you flip a light switch, remember, the sea didn't just carry explorers and traders, it fueled civilization itself, one harpoon strike at a time. Clipper ships didn't just sail, they flew across the water like seabirds riding a hurricane, with their knife-edged bows slicing through waves and clouds of canvas stretching taller than cathedral spires. These vessels turned the ocean into a racetrack. Picture the Cutty Sark in 1872, her crew scrambling up rigging as taut as piano wires, racing to bring that season's Chinese tea to London's docks before competing ships. The difference between first and second place could mean bankruptcy or fortune. Such was the desperation for fresh leaves that hadn't lost their aroma during months at sea. What made clippers revolutionary wasn't just their speed, but their precision engineering. Naval architects like Donald Mackay studied seabird wings to perfect hull shapes that minimized drag. Every spar, every rope had a purpose. Even the copper sheathing on their hulls was polished smoother than mirrors to cheat friction. A well-handled clipper could sustain 20 knots faster than most steamships of the era by harnessing wind patterns with mathematical exactness. Captains became celestial gamblers, betting on obscure currents like the Great Circle Route that shaved weeks off trips to California during the gold rush. The cargoes these ships carried reshaped empires. British clippers hauled opium from India to China, fueling addiction crises that tilted trade balances. American ships like the Flying Cloud set records bringing prospectors to San Francisco, their holds packed with mining tools and dreams. Even mundane goods became high-stakes commodities. A single early shipment of Chilean guano could fertilize English fields for a season, making the difference between harvest and famine. Yet the true legacy of clippers lies in their cultural impact. Shipbuilders in Maine and Aberdeen competed to erect ever taller masts, their shipyards becoming Silicon Valleys of maritime innovation. Newspapers printed daily updates on clipper positions as if covering sporting events. And when the Great Tea Race of 1866 ended with the Teeping and Ariel docking in London within minutes of each other after a 100-day sprint from China, the public celebrated like their team had won the World Cup. This speed came at a human cost. Crews worked 4-hour sleep cycles in all weather, their hands shredded by hemp ropes. The infamous Cape Horn dance saw sailors balancing on icy yards to reef sails in screaming winds. Many ships pushed so hard they vanished without trace, their wooden hulls overstressed until they simply disintegrated in mid-ocean. The sea rewarded audacity, but punished even the slightest miscalculation. Clipper's dominance was brief but brilliant. By the 1870s, steam engines and the Suez Canal made their wind-powered speed obsolete. Yet they'd proven something transformative, that the ocean could be tamed not just for survival or profit, but for the sheer thrill of velocity. Modern container ships with their predictable schedules owe a debt to these greyhounds of the sea, the first vessels to treat the planet's waterways not as barriers, but as stopwatches waiting to be beaten. The desert sands of Egypt had resisted the sea's advance for millennia until human ambition carved a path through. When the Suez Canal opened in 1869, it didn't just connect two bodies of water, it collapsed the map itself. Suddenly, a ship bound from London to Mumbai could skip the 16,000-mile detour around Africa, slicing the journey to just 7,000 miles. What had been a months-long ordeal became a weeks-long sprint, rewriting the rules of global commerce overnight. The canal's construction was as audacious as its impact, 10 years of dredging by 30,000 laborers under the scorching sun, moving enough sand to bury Manhattan 10 feet deep. This wasn't just an engineering feat, it was a geopolitical earthquake. The Ottoman Empire, which had controlled overland routes for centuries, watched helplessly as its leverage evaporated. British strategists realized overnight that controlling this slender waterway meant controlling access to India, the crown jewel of their empire. Within a decade, red-coated soldiers were guarding the canal zone, turning Egypt into a de facto British protectorate. Even the canal's financing revealed the New World Order. Shares sold to European investors bankrolled the project, making the Suez the first truly global infrastructure megaproject. The ripple effects transformed maritime technology. Ships that had been designed for the punishing Cape Horn route suddenly seemed clumsy in the canal's narrow confines. Naval architects responded with longer, leaner hulls and more efficient steam engines to navigate the straight shot without stopping for coal. Port cities like Aden and Port Said boomed as coaling stations, while others like Cape Town watched their golden age fade as traffic bypassed them entirely. The sea had always shaped trade, but now a ditch in the desert dictated which harbors thrived and which withered. Cultural exchange accelerated at dizzying speeds. Pilgrims from Java could now reach Mecca in weeks instead of months, transforming the Hajj into a more accessible ritual. Japanese silk merchants raced European tea clippers through the canal, their cargoes arriving in London before the leaves lost their fragrance. Even the humble potato traveled new routes. Peruvian varieties shipped to India via Suez revolutionized subcontinent agriculture, while Egyptian cotton flooded Lancashire mills, fueling the Industrial Revolution's textile boom. Yet the canal's greatest power lay in its fragility. A single grounded ship could paralyze global trade, as the Ever Given proved in 2021. Wars erupted over its control, from the Anglo-French invasion of 1956 to the tanker battles of the 1980s. Today, 12% of all global trade still flows through this artificial gorge, a testament to how one narrow cut through sand reshaped the planet's economic arteries more thoroughly than any natural strait ever could. The age-old dominance of wind and current had met its match, human ingenuity with a shovel. The first puffs of smoke from a steamship's funnel didn't just signal a new engine, they heralded the death knell for an entire era. When the SS Savannah crossed the Atlantic in 1819, skeptics laughed at her hybrid design, paddle wheels that folded up when sails took over. But within decades, those clanking, soot-belching behemoths would render centuries of sailing knowledge obsolete. The sea, once ruled by the whims of wind, now bent to the rhythm of pistons and pressure gauges. Iron hulls turned ships from floating woodpiles into unstoppable giants. Where wooden vessels might splinter in a storm or rot in tropical waters, iron, and later steel, could shrug off hurricanes and termites alike. The Great Eastern, launched in 1858, stretched nearly 700 feet, longer than any ship before it, with room for 4,000 passengers and enough coal to circle the globe without refueling. This wasn't just progress, it was maritime hubris made manifest, a declaration that humans could now outmuscle nature itself. Propellers sealed the sail's fate. Early steamships used paddle wheels that thrashed inefficiently in rough seas, but screw propellers changed everything. Hidden beneath the waterline, these twisting blades could harness every ounce of a steam engine's power, pushing ships forward even when winds died or waves towered. Naval engineers became obsessed with propeller pitch and blade count, fine-tuning designs like concert pianists adjusting their instruments. By the 1870s, a steamship could maintain 12 knots regardless of weather, a consistency unthinkable in the age of canvas. Coal transformed geography itself. Ports like Cardiff and Newcastle boomed as fueling stations, their harbors clogged with colliers loading black gold. The British Empire strung coaling depots from Gibraltar to Hong Kong, turning the ocean into a network of pit stops. But this dependence had dark consequences. Ships now carried explosive bunkers of coal dust, and crews, often Shanghaied drunkards or desperate migrants, suffocated in filthy holds shoveling fuel into insatiable boilers. The romance of the sea gave way to the grind of industry. Yet for all their brute efficiency, steamships couldn't kill tradition overnight. Clipper ships still dominated the tea trade until the Suez Canal's opening in 1869. Steamers needed the canal's shortcut to compete with sails on long routes. Even into the 1880s, windjammers carried bulk cargo like Chilean nitrates, their slower speeds offset by zero fuel costs. The ocean remained big enough for both visions for a time. The true legacy of steam wasn't just speed, but predictability. Insurance rates plummeted as schedules replaced guesswork. Emigrants could book passage from Naples to New York with departure dates printed on tickets. Fresh Australian mutton reached London docks before it spoiled, and Peruvian guano arrived in time for European spring planting. The sea had become a conveyor belt, its rhythms dictated not by nature, but by man-made timetables and the steady thump of engines below decks. What was lost in this transition? The artistry of sailors who could read a cloud's shape to predict squalls, the camaraderie of crews hauling sheets in unison, the quiet terror of being becalmed in the doldrums. The steamship's victory was complete, but its triumph carried a whisper of nostalgia for an age when humans worked with the wind rather than against it, when the ocean still held mysteries no engine could conquer. Guglielmo Marconi's radio crackled to life in 1897, sending invisible waves skimming across the sea's surface, a miracle that would rewrite the rules of maritime survival. Before this moment, ships vanished into the Atlantic's fog like ghosts, their fates unknown until wreckage washed ashore months later. Now, a distress signal could leap from a foundering vessel to shore stations hundreds of miles away, turning the ocean from a vast isolation chamber into a networked community. The Titanic's sinking in 1912 tragically proved both the technology's power and its limits. Though her radio calls saved 700 lives, nearby ships with silent radios never heard the plea. The magic lay in Marconi's spark gap transmitter, a device that looked like something from a mad scientist's workshop, spitting blue bolts of electricity between brass spheres. These jagged pulses morphed into Morse code, bouncing off the ionosphere to travel far beyond the horizon. Early shipboard installations required operators who could interpret the eerie clicks through headphones, their ears trained to separate life or death messages from the static of thunderstorms. By 1904, the first international distress frequency crackled to life at 500 kHz, standardized so any ship could understand another's cry for help. Port cities became nerve centers of this new web. Cape Race in Newfoundland intercepted messages from Europe before they reached New York, giving newspapers scoops on transatlantic events. Honolulu Station relayed weather reports across the Pacific, allowing captains to skirt typhoons. Even isolated lighthouses gained radio rooms, their operators suddenly the most informed hermits on Earth. The sea's age-old silence had been shattered, replaced by a constant hum of commerce, diplomacy, and emergency, all flowing through the ether. Yet radio did more than prevent disasters. It dissolved cultural barriers. When the luxury liner Mauretania hosted the first ship-to-shore concert in 1910, passengers in mid-ocean heard Caruso sing live from New York's Metropolitan Opera. Fishermen off Iceland learned of market prices in real time, adjusting their catches before returning to port. The ocean, once a moat between civilizations, now carried the first whispers of global connectivity, a prototype for the internet age. The technology's dark side emerged during wartime. German U-boats in World War I used radios to coordinate wolfpack attacks, while British intelligence intercepted naval codes by triangulating transmissions. By World War II, radar and encrypted radios turned the sea into an electronic battlefield, where detecting a signal could mean salvation or annihilation. The same waves that saved merchant sailors also guided torpedoes toward their hulls. Today's satellite networks trace their lineage to those early spark gap crackles. Distress beacons automatically ping search and rescue satellites, while cargo ships stream engine diagnostics to onshore technicians. But the romance hasn't entirely faded. Amateur radio operators still chat with passing vessels, keeping alive the tradition of human voices crossing watery distances. Marconi's invention didn't just tame the sea's dangers, it preserved its wonder, letting us shout across the waves while still feeling the thrill of the unknown. The Titanic's maiden voyage was meant to be a triumph, a floating palace declaring humanity's mastery over the sea. With her 16 watertight compartments and electric lights gleaming against the night, she was dubbed unsinkable by the press, a testament to Edwardian engineering pride. Yet when the iceberg's jagged edge tore through her hull on April 14, 1912, it wasn't just steel that fractured, it was the unshakable confidence of an age. The coldest irony, the very features meant to ensure her invincibility hastened her doom. Those watertight compartments, which should have contained the flooding, instead trapped water asymmetrically, pulling the bow deeper until the sea could spill over each successive bulkhead. The ocean, indifferent to human hubris, exploited every flaw. Radio operators frantically tapped distress calls into the dark as lifeboats launched half-empty, some passengers refusing to believe the unsinkable ship could founder until the deck tilted beneath their feet. The Carpathia, 58 miles away, raced through ice fields to rescue survivors, but for over 1,500 souls, the Atlantic's 2-degree water became a frozen grave. The tragedy laid bare uncomfortable truths. Lifeboat shortages prioritized aesthetics over safety, crew training had been cursory, and the ship's speed through iceberg-laden waters reflected a reckless faith in technology. Yet the Titanic's legacy isn't just a cautionary tale. Her sinking birthed the International Ice Patrol to monitor North Atlantic hazards, revolutionized maritime safety regulations requiring lifeboats for all passengers, and standardized 24-hour radio watches. Even the humble whistle carried by lifeboat crews traces to that night when survivors blew them to locate each other in the darkness. The ocean had issued a brutal reminder: no vessel, no matter how grand, could defy its fundamental laws. What lingers most powerfully isn't the wreckage on the seafloor, but the cultural reckoning. Poets and philosophers grappled with the symbolism: a Gilded Age microcosm sinking into the abyss, first-class opulence no shield against primal forces. The sea, once a conquered highway, had reasserted its caprice. Modern cruise ships may dwarf the Titanic in size, but their safety protocols, evacuation drills, redundant navigation systems still whisper her name. Every time a captain slows for fog or a life jacket is inspected, the ghost of that April night nods in grim approval. The waves don't forgive shortcuts, and the deep keeps its own time. The rumbling thunder of naval guns in World War I shattered any lingering illusions of the sea as a peaceful highway. When Britain's Grand Fleet faced Germany's High Seas Fleet at Jutland in 1916, it wasn't just steel behemoths clashing, it was a battle for the very lifelines of empire. The British had woven a global web of coaling stations and telegraph cables, while Germany's hunger for colonies left its ships stranded like wolves cut from the pack. That day in the North Sea, over 250 warships exchanged 12,000 shells in history's largest battleship duel, yet the real victory came not from sinking tonnage, but from the unbroken blockade that slowly starved Germany of food and fuel. The ocean had become a noose tightened by naval supremacy. Submarines turned the maritime world upside down. German U-boats slithered through shipping lanes like invisible assassins, sinking 1 in 4 British merchant ships by 1917. The sea, once a surface to be crossed, now held threats in every fathom of its depths. Convoys became floating cities, cargo ships herded by destroyers with depth charges, their crews scanning waves for the telltale periscope's feather. When the Lusitania went down with 1,200 souls in 1915, it proved civilian vessels weren't just collateral damage, but strategic targets. The rules of naval warfare had been rewritten in torpedo wakes. World War II amplified these stakes to apocalyptic levels. The Battle of the Atlantic became a three-dimensional chess game between U-boats and sonar-equipped escorts, where breaking naval codes meant the difference between a supply convoy reaching England or vanishing beneath the waves. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, aircraft carriers rendered battleships nearly obsolete overnight. At Midway in 1942, dive bombers from American flat-tops sank 4 Japanese carriers in minutes, a victory won not by towering gun turrets, but by pilots who'd never seen the enemy ships until they appeared through their bomb sights. The ocean's surface was now just one layer in a war fought from the seabed to the stratosphere. Amphibious landings revealed the sea's cruel duality. It could be both highway and moat. When Allied troops stormed Normandy's beaches on D-Day, the English Channel served as their protective cloak during the crossing, then became a deadly funnel as German machine guns pinned them against the tide. The Pacific Island hopping campaign turned coral atolls into blood-soaked stepping stones, where controlling the sea meant controlling whether reinforcements or starvation reached the defenders. Navies didn't just fight on water, they projected power onto land through shelling and logistics, making the coastline itself a contested frontier. Yet beyond the battles, the most enduring naval legacy was technological. Radar let ships see through fog and darkness, sonar peeled back the ocean's opaque veil, and naval aviation shrank the planet by turning aircraft into seaborne scouts. The Manhattan Project's atomic bombs were delivered not by long-range bombers alone, but by submarines and surface ships that crossed thousands of miles undetected. By war's end, the sea wasn't just a battleground, it was the ultimate strategic chessboard, where controlling the waves meant controlling the fate of continents. The age of wooden ships and iron men had given way to an era where victory floated on oil slicks and radio waves, proving that mastery of the ocean still meant mastery of the world. The war had barely ended when an unassuming truck driver from North Carolina changed the world with a simple idea. What if cargo didn't need to be loaded piece by piece? Malcolm McLean's vision of standardized shipping containers seemed laughable in 1956 when his converted tanker, the Ideal X, carried 58 metal boxes from Newark to Houston. Yet within decades, those uniform steel boxes would shrink the planet more thoroughly than any jet engine, turning the ocean into the silent scaffolding of globalization. The magic wasn't just in the containers themselves, but in the ecosystem they spawned. Cranes that plucked boxes like chess pieces, ports redesigned as parking lots for floating warehouses, and ships so vast they could barely squeeze through the Panama Canal. Consider the mathematics of disruption. Before containers, loading a ship cost nearly $6 per ton and took weeks as longshoremen hauled crates on their backs. With containers at 20 cents per ton loaded in hours, suddenly it became cheaper to weave a sweater in Vietnam, ship it to Italy for buttons, then send it to Canadian stores than to make it locally. Ports like Singapore, once a sleepy colonial outpost, exploded into megahubs where a ship arrives every 2 minutes, each one carrying enough goods to fill a Walmart supercenter 50 times over. The sea didn't just connect economies, it fused them into a single, pulsating network where Chilean cherries appear in Beijing markets before their stems dry. The engineering behind this revolution hides in plain sight. Modern container ships stretch a quarter-mile longer than the Empire State Building, laid sideways with engines the size of apartment blocks gulping bunker fuel so thick it must be heated to flow. Yet their true genius lies in modularity. Every container's corners lock into a universal grid, allowing Chinese electronics to stack seamlessly atop Brazilian coffee sacks. Even the chaos of weather bows to this system. Radar and GPS let captains plot courses where waves won't topple towering stacks, while algorithms determine which boxes to unload first in Rotterdam based on thousands of real-time variables from train schedules to highway traffic. What's often overlooked is how containers democratize trade. A family-owned Oregon hazelnut farm can now rent half a container to ship directly to German bakeries, bypassing middlemen who once took most profits. African mango growers access European supermarkets because refrigerated reefers keep fruit fresh across equatorial heat. The sea's role shifted from moving bulk commodities to enabling just-in-time production. Japanese car factories receive Welsh bolts and Mexican upholstery with hourly precision, their supply chains as finely tuned as symphony orchestras. Yet this system's fragility mirrors its brilliance. When the Ever Given blocked the Suez Canal in 2021, global trade seized like a clogged artery, costing $10 billion daily. Pirates off Somalia learned to hijack not for treasure, but for ransom. The average container ship's cargo exceeds $100 million worth of iPhones, pharmaceuticals, and designer jeans. Even climate change threatens routes as Arctic ice melts, tempting shortcuts where rescue stations don't exist. The ultimate testament to containers' triumph isn't in ports or ships, but in your home. The device you're watching this on, the shoes by your door, the coffee in your cupboard, 90% of it floated across oceans in a steel box you'll never see. The Phoenicians traded glass beads across the Mediterranean. The VOC shipped spices in chests, but today's maritime highways move the very stuff of modern life, silently and ceaselessly, proving that the greatest revolutions aren't always the loudest. Sometimes they're just boxes. Beneath the shimmering surface of today's shipping lanes lies an ecological toll the ancient Phoenicians could never have imagined. A single modern container ship burns through 300 tons of diesel daily, spewing sulfur emissions equivalent to 50 million cars, making maritime transport simultaneously the backbone of global trade and one of its dirtiest secrets. The ocean that once carried explorers and empires now bears scars from our carelessness: ghost nets strangling sea turtles, oil slicks smothering plankton blooms, and invisible clouds of microplastics infiltrating every level of the food chain. Take the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, a swirling vortex of debris twice the size of Texas, where plastic outnumbers plankton 6-1. These aren't just soda bottles bobbing on waves. Sunlight and salt break them into confetti-sized particles that fish mistake for food, carrying toxins up the food chain to our dinner plates. Meanwhile, underwater sound pollution from ship propellers drowns out whale songs, disrupting migrations that predate human civilization. The very waves that carried Zheng his treasure ships now carry a slower, deadlier cargo. Coral reefs, the rainforests of the sea, are vanishing at alarming rates. Shipping lanes introduce invasive species through ballast water discharges, while sunscreen-laden tourists from cruise ships bleach delicate polyps. The result: 30% of reefs have already died, taking with them nurseries for a quarter of marine species. Even the sea's chemistry is changing. Absorbed carbon dioxide from ship emissions turns waters acidic, dissolving shellfish larvae before they can form protective shells. Yet solutions emerge from the crisis itself. The Maersk Line's carbon-neutral vessels run on green methanol, proving fossil fuels aren't mandatory. The ocean cleanup project's floating barriers skim plastic from gyres using the sea's own currents. And ancient maritime wisdom returns in modern form. Sail cargo companies transport gore, make coffee across the Atlantic in emission-free tall ships, their schedules dictated by wind rather than Wall Street. The sea's resilience offers cautious hope. When the Exxon Valdez spill blackened Alaska's shores in 1989, biologists predicted decades of devastation. Yet within years, herring and otters rebounded, their populations adapting with eerie precision. This doesn't excuse our negligence, but reveals nature's stubborn will to heal, if we ease our grip. The ocean that birthed civilization now asks for reciprocity, to trade our carelessness for stewardship, ensuring its waves continue connecting humanity without drowning in our waste. The Jolly Roger may have faded into history, but piracy never truly vanished. It simply upgraded its tools. Modern buccaneers prowling the waters off Somalia aren't wielding cutlasses. They're armed with satellite phones and AK-47s, tracking merchant ships via live maritime traffic apps. In 2011 alone, pirates launched 237 attacks in the Gulf of Aden, turning one of the world's busiest shipping lanes into a high-stakes game of cat and mouse. Their business model is chillingly efficient. Swarm a cargo ship with speedboats, scale the hull with grappling hooks, and hold crew and cargo for millions in ransom, averaging $5 million per vessel by 2020. What's startling isn't just the persistence of piracy, but its evolution. Somali fishermen, once pushed to desperation by foreign trawlers decimating their waters, realized hijacking ships paid better than hauling nets. Soon, entire coastal villages transformed into pirate syndicates, with investors fronting cash for GPS units and outboard motors in exchange for a cut of the spoils. The sea's lawlessness became an industry, complete with negotiators fluent in maritime insurance law and accountants laundering ransom payments through Dubai's real estate market. Southeast Asia tells a different story. Here, pirates favor hit and run, thefts slipping onto anchored tankers at night to siphon oil into waiting barges, or stealing entire shipments of palm oil worth $500,000 in minutes. The Malacca Strait, narrower than the Hudson River at points, forces ships to slow down, creating perfect ambush points. Unlike Somalia's headline-grabbing kidnappings, these attacks often go unreported. Shipping companies calculate that admitting vulnerability could spike insurance premiums higher than the cost of stolen cargo. Countermeasures read like spy novels. Crews on high-risk routes train with fire hoses to repel boarders, while some ships deploy electrified fences along their rails. Private security teams, often ex-special forces, patrol decks with rifles, though their presence kicks off legal tangles when entering ports with strict weapon laws. The most ingenious defense might be the long-range acoustic device, a sonic cannon that blasts eardrum-shattering noise at approaching skiffs. Yet the sea's vastness still favors the predator. Even with NATO patrols and armed convoys, pirates adapt, shifting operations further offshore or disguising themselves as fishing boats. The ocean's oldest truth endures: where trade flows, opportunists follow. Today's pirates may lack the romance of wooden legs and parrots, but they prove that the water's edge remains humanity's last ungoverned space, a reminder that for all our container ships and satellites, the sea still bows to no law but its own. The horizon of maritime trade shimmers with possibilities as radical as those that once greeted the first Phoenician traders. Imagine a cargo vessel slicing through the North Atlantic at midnight. No captain on the bridge, no crew in the bunks, just algorithms navigating by starlight and satellite. Autonomous ships like Norway's Yara Birkeland already ply short routes, their sensors tracking currents and weather with machine-like precision no human could sustain. These aren't just unmanned boats, they're floating supercomputers that never sleep, never panic, and crucially, never demand salaries. The economics are irresistible. Removing crew quarters and life support systems frees up 15% more space for cargo, while AI route optimization slashes fuel costs by 20%. But the real revolution lies in safety. 80% of maritime accidents stem from human error, fatigue, miscommunication, cut corners. Machines don't get distracted by a storm's roar or overlook a collision warning. Yet the ocean resists easy mastery. Hackers could turn autonomous fleets into drifting hazards, and pirates might find hijacking a digital ship as simple as cracking its encryption. Insurers balk at who's liable when code fails mid-voyage, and in the storm-lashed latitudes where waves tower over 10-story buildings, even the most advanced AI still struggles to mimic a seasoned captain's gut instincts. The sea has humbled human arrogance before. Remember the unsinkable Titanic, and skeptics whisper that no algorithm can yet read the ocean's mercurial moods. Meanwhile, the fuel powering these future fleets is undergoing its own metamorphosis. The stench of sulfurous bunker fuel, so thick it used to coat sailors' lungs, is giving way to hydrogen cells and ammonia engines. Maersk's carbon-neutral methanol ships burn so clean their exhaust could almost be bottled as air. But the real game-changer lurks beneath the waves. Nuclear-powered cargo vessels like Russia's Sevmorput hint at a future where ships refuel once a decade. Imagine the geopolitical shifts when Middle Eastern oil stops dictating shipping routes, replaced by nations producing green hydrogen from solar-powered seawater electrolysis. The same winds that once filled sails now spin offshore turbines to produce fuel, a poetic full circle. Beneath the surface, drones are mapping a hidden dimension of trade. Autonomous underwater vehicles now inspect pipelines with laser precision, their sonar eyes spotting corrosion invisible to human divers. In the Persian Gulf, drone swarms patrol for mines, while in the Arctic, they chart melting ice lanes too dangerous for manned ships. The next frontier, subsea cargo tunnels where torpedo-shaped pods whisk high-value goods between continents at submarine speeds, bypassing storms and pirates alike. Norway's proposed Seaway project envisions an underwater highway linking fjords to offshore hubs, a concept that would make Jules Verne grin. Will these innovations dethrone the ocean as Earth's primary trade route? Unlikely. Air freight remains 10 times costlier for bulk goods, and hyperloop land networks can't match the sea's sheer volume. Instead, the maritime world is evolving into a hybrid ecosystem, where 1,000-foot container ships glide autonomously alongside wind-assisted cargo schooners, their routes optimized by quantum computers crunching centuries of wave data. The ocean's dominance isn't fading, it's becoming smarter, cleaner, and stranger than our ancestors could have dreamed. As we stand on the shore of this new age, one truth endures: the sea doesn't just carry our future, it invents it, one wave of innovation at a time. From the moment the first daring souls lashed logs together to cross a river, the sea has whispered promises and perils to those willing to listen. Those humble rafts, barely more than floating bundles of reeds, carried more than people. They carried the spark of connection that would ignite empires. Fast forward to today, where colossal container ships the length of skyscrapers glide across the same waters, their steel bellies stuffed with everything from smartphones to soybeans. The scale has changed, but the ocean's role hasn't. It remains the world's original and most essential network, a liquid highway older than the Silk Road and busier than any airport. Consider how deeply the sea shaped human destiny. The Mediterranean wasn't just a body of water, it was the incubator of democracy, philosophy, and maritime law, all born from the necessity of trading across its waves. The Indian Ocean's monsoon winds didn't merely fill sails, they carried Buddhism from India to Java and Islam to the Swahili coast, blending cultures like currents mixing in a tide. Even the Atlantic, once feared as the Sea of Darkness, became the bridge that bound Europe, Africa, and the Americas into an involuntary triad of exchange for better and worse. The ocean doesn't discriminate. It connects whatever we ask of it, whether spices or slaves, ideas or epidemics. What's astonishing isn't just the ocean's past, but its present invisibility. 90% of everything you own likely crossed a sea at some point, yet we rarely think about the voyage behind our coffee beans or sneakers. Modern ports like Shanghai or Rotterdam operate with the precision of Swiss watches, unloading a container every 2 seconds around the clock. The sea has become so efficient at its job that it's rendered itself nearly invisible, a paradox of infrastructure. The more vital it is, the less we notice it. Yet the lessons of maritime history ripple into our future. The Phoenicians thrived not by conquering land, but by mastering the art of connection, their alphabet, their trade networks, their adaptability. The Vikings proved that exploration and commerce could be two sides of the same coin, and the tragedy of the Titanic reminds us that no technology, no matter how advanced, can override the ocean's fundamental laws. As we face rising seas and melting ice caps, these stories aren't just relics, they're roadmaps. The sea has always demanded resilience, innovation, and respect from those who depend on it. So the next time you stand on a shore, watching the horizon where sky meets water, remember, you're gazing at the original internet, the first globalization engine, the silent partner in every bite of food and every gadget in your home. The ocean doesn't just separate continents, it stitches them together, one wave at a time. Thanks for joining me on this journey through the tides of history. If you've enjoyed unraveling these maritime mysteries, hit that like button, subscribe for more deep dives, and let me know in the comments what's the most surprising sea story you've ever heard. Until our next adventure, keep exploring because the world, like the ocean, is far stranger and more connected than it seems.